Welcome, everybody, to a brand new episode of the Radiohead Retrospective of the Jams and Tea podcast, where we go through in chronological order the records, the studio albums of the band Radiohead. Last week, we dissected the monolithic achievement in alternative rock history known as OK Computer, the full artistic arrival of Radiohead that sort of ushered in the sea change of their career. And today we are going to be talking about the follow-up to that album, the incredibly acclaimed, if not even more so than OK Computer. We're talking about Kid A this week.
Yeah, on the note of like acclaim, like it's quite interesting that now these two records are both sort of seen as these totemic points in Radiohead's career. But like if you compare the way they were initially received on release, it's like this polar opposite in a sense. OK Computer being universally acclaimed and Kid A being definitely positively received, but much more divisive. And so it's interesting the way that time has shaped perceptions of these records, and that's something we can talk about a little bit. But in order to talk about Kid A and like in order to even approach what this album is, what it's about, and how it sounds, we have to talk about the 3 years that led up to its release. Essentially, this incredibly turbulent time for the band. Something I spoke on in the last episode, I think, maybe in both of the last two episodes, is how for the progression of a band, Radiohead's sonic progression as well as their popularity increased at this exponential rate that's kind of staggeringly fast if you really stop to think about it for a minute. Like the amount of time between Pablo Honey and OK Computer is, I mean, it's 4 years. It's not that long. It's kind of fucking stupid when you think about it for a second. And so like obviously Radiohead are a band that were coming into their own creatively and, you know, at breakneck pace, and they were just realizing their ideas and realizing their ambition more and more with each record. And for that to be complemented by similar levels of intensity and the reception to those records gradually with each one, you know, it puts this increasing exponential pressure on a band, especially a band like Radiohead, with each record to match the hype, to live up to the expectations, and to continue to push forward and do something meaningful. And that kind of reached fever pitch with OK Computer, right? Because as we've discussed, that is an album that was received as rapturously as a record possibly could be. We talk about it now in terms of being a significant influential musical moment in the same way as the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Band. And that's very easy to see now with all of the, you know, bands and influence that has come in the wake of it. But people were saying similar things at the time OK Computer came out. Like there was just this instant understanding that it was something important for music. And so that's, you know, that's a rare kind of once in a generation, once in a fucking half century kind of thing to have it at that level. And so how do you build on that? Like, how do you respond to that? It's physically impossible, right? You're literally hitting your ceiling, right? In terms of creative realization of a particular sonic template. We talked about how busy and huge and bustling and manic and crazed and varied OK Computer is. It is the absolute zenith of everything they were chasing up to that point in their career. There's simply no topping it. There's no building on it. And I think Radiohead, to some extent, must have realized that early on in the wave of time after its release. They embarked on a gigantic touring cycle for that record, as you would expect when you have an album that is received as rapturously as it is. Radiohead's world tour that followed was the biggest tour they'd ever experienced, obviously. And frankly, while it both helped escalate the band to this kind of world-conquering status, it also, in a very, very real sense, almost led to the band's dissolution entirely, indirectly at the very least. It was, and I'm sure Tom York would tell you, and spoke frankly at the time and has spoken frankly since, probably the most tumultuous period of his life, and a time of incredible personal strain. for Tom, and I mean for the band as a whole as well. Like it's just an unfathomable thing to have to experience and respond to and live up to and all that sort of stuff. And Tom is a person who, while there is a yearning, there's admittedly a yearning for the spotlight that has been present ever since the Pablo Honey days. It's less a yearning for the spotlight for Tom and more just kind of a yearning to communicate through music the feelings that the music that means the most to him has communicated as he's grown up. It's more a desire to kind of have a voice in that way than a desire to be famous. And so Tom York was having to confront, and I mean over the years leading up to OK Computer, it had built as well, but he was really seriously having to confront being the biggest rock star in the world. And when you're a person like Tom York, being a rock star is foreign and strange and uncomfortable enough. But being the biggest rock star in the world is kind of impossible to even conceive of. And it is fair to say that Tom York had several full-on mental breakdowns during the touring cycle and aftermath of the release of OK Computer. Frankly, it is a miracle that he ever emerged out the other side in one piece. This, and I know that Saoirse watched this documentary recently. This was, and so Saoirse, I'll let you speak on this in a sec, but this was documented vividly in the documentary Meeting People is Easy, which was a document of the touring cycle and the just general album cycle of following the release of OK Computer, and is one of the most kind of just genuinely haunting and devastating rock documentaries I've ever seen. I haven't seen it in many years, but I remember vividly the tone of it is so different to your other typical rock documentaries because it's so focused on the just absolutely harrowing experience that whole thing was for Tom. And it's a kind of ironic, harrowing tragedy, right? Because he's getting everything he ever wanted and he's getting kind of all this acclaim and respect. And people are appreciating Radiohead in the way that they want to be appreciated as well. It's not this facile thing where they appreciate Tom solely as a rock god. Like people were appreciating the things he was saying, but it was happening to this level where he was kind of basically being held up as this kind of totemic voice that I don't think he ever really envisioned himself as. And in many ways, for Tom, overshadowed and reduced to irrelevance the actual points he wanted to make and the actual, parts of his creative drive that mean something to him. So there's that. That whole psychological experience of Tom and of course of the rest of the band as well, but it's mostly really kind of what we know of it is mostly really surrounding Tom, is fundamental to the period that followed, where Radiohead had to do that classic band narrative thing of actually thinking about what is the next step going to be. And it's fair to say there was a real sort of creative stasis that followed this. It was exhausting. Radiohead didn't even begin to start thinking about their follow-up record until early in 1999, when they sort of started convening to try and envision what they were going to do and sort of start jamming and figure out where to go next. And it's fair to say that the early parts of the recording process in the first sort of 6 to 8 months of 1999 were fraught, frankly, basically, entirely static. Like they were at this brick wall. York was seriously unwell. He described himself during this period as completely unhinged. Colin has stated, and Johnny and Ed have all talked about to various extents, the general agreement that they all had that, as I said, you reach this zenith of a particular sound, of a particular aesthetic with OK Computer. It goes without saying that you can't attempt to do that again. But yet there was still division among the ranks in terms of where they would go. Ed, I think in particular, was taken aback by the notion that that Tom and Johnny wanted and the rest of the band wanted to take this album follow-up record in a more kind of abstract and electronic and rhythm-focused direction. His vision was that they would continue to be kind of melodic and anthemic, but just change the way that they approach that. But York outright rejected that. He said in his words, was completely fed up with melody and I just wanted rhythm. And that particular approach, I think, not only deeply imbues this album, but a lot of subsequent Radiohead records as well. And so this is the setting where they're convening and trying to picture what this new phase of Radiohead could possibly be. The records that they were listening to during the process of living and responding to OK Computer and thinking about the future were eclectic and diverse. I spoke briefly in the last episode about the influence of Talking Heads' Remain in Light on the approach to sonic density and rhythm that Radiohead employed throughout OK Computer, particularly in songs like Airbag. But that kind of rhythm focus and sort of disorientation of that album, York has stated, was far even more influential on the creation of Kid A, as was a growing fascination within many members of the band, particularly York, with electronic music, synthetic sounds. This idea that you could communicate feeling in a way that didn't rely so heavily on the human voice and didn't rely so heavily on recognizable timbres and textures. And also, like, that's a natural outgrowth as well of just Johnny and Ed and Colin and Phil's continuing fascination with just like exploring different instrumentation as well, like learning new things. We talked a little bit about how they, there's lots of varied instrumentation that's incorporated into OK Computer that, is so like different from the Bends. And Johnny coming into his own as a kind of string arranger as well, with songs like Climbing Up the Walls. And so all of these kind of continuing influences from the outside and restless creative drive that was happening were feeding into the mindset during the process of trying to envision what Kid A would be. But I think ultimately we will talk about the sounds of this record. We'll talk about how these potential influences manifest. But I think by and large, I mean, as I see it, the biggest influence, the biggest kind of point to Kid A, the kind of thing that this whole record is about, and the thing that is the best framework to approach understanding it, is Tom York's mental state and the idea of being at a complete distance from both the world around you and yourself and your identity, this dissociation that pervades a lot of the feeling on this album as well. It is an album about being deeply unwell and deeply distant. And we talked on OK Computer, there's a song called Subterranean Homesick Alien where Tom sings about wanting to be abducted by aliens to have his view of the world change, to be able to adopt this new perspective, as well as to be able to be free of the people in the world around him. Whereas with Kid A, it's almost like Tom becomes the alien himself. Like it's almost like Tom recedes from his humanity and embraces a synthetic world.
Yeah, I mean, that's in the title, like it's not just that he's a kid, so he's a full human with emotions and feelings and all, but he's unformed, immature, and he's Kid A, so he is numerically processed, sort of outside of normal humanity. The great thing about the documentary is that there's a couple of really important moments. One of which is Tom is giving an answer to an interviewer who's asking him sort of what he thinks about the public's reaction to the music. And he says, look, we've already done our bit. We made the album. I just want to put out the album and get on with it. And then there's a very important moment where basically Tom agrees with the interviewers that the image of the rock star is kind of done. And rock is kind of in a dying state at the point at which he is working. And this all, for me, sort of combines into the state where Tom York is, at the moment, the biggest rock star on the planet, but in a way in which what it means to be a rock star in the wake of like Kurt Cobain's death means increasingly little. And you feel like he wants to basically retreat from whatever his life means after OK Computer. And so Kid A, this album that sounds like someone smoked a lot of weed and got very sad and listened to Idioteque and then wrote an album, that seems like a natural step. That's not to say there aren't guitars and rock moments. You've got the National Anthem, which was meant to be a song on OK Computer that they delayed recording. And you've got Optimistic as well. But there's stuff like Treefingers, which is much more electronic and dry. It feels like an album made by someone who made one of the most celebrated albums ever made and hated what it turned his life into. So sonically tried to go as far in the other direction as possible. And it's like why I love Searching for a Form of Clarity by Against Me. It's an album made by someone who like hates their position in the industry and wants to make something very unfriendly. And I love it.
Yeah, it's a very kind of common sort of story and a kind of almost archetypal story for a rock band. But in many ways, because of the magnitude of this story, like the size of what Radiohead were, and then the dramatic nature of the shift, it's kind of become the classic example of it. But I'm curious, again, before we start digging into particular songs with any level of detail, what you guys think of the shift that this record makes in terms of approach and feel and sound for Radiohead. One of our kind of recurring aspects of this series has been that, we're a bunch of Radiohead fans, and also August, who is not a Radiohead fan, who is new to most of their music, approaching this, including Kid A. So August, I'd love to hear from you just on what your initial reaction was to the sound of this record, and what, I guess, how you feel about that.
Okay, that's something I remember very vividly, because I remember, just without going into any opinion-based things, I remember putting on everything in its right place and just finding myself completely just utterly confused for a moment or two, because, and it reminds me of something I said earlier in this series, which I mentioned at the group chat, that I had said in our first episode on Pablo Honey, where I couldn't imagine what OK Computer sounded like. And in retrospect, I think OK Computer is not a necessarily completely natural, but a natural enough progression from that album. It makes sense with their influences and growing ambitions. This came out of left field for me because I had known they had taken up some more like vaguely electronic influences on this album, but I did not really comprehend the degree to which that was until I properly sat down and listened to that. And it's a beguiling experience upon first listen. Like, I really struggled to piece together how I even felt. And I think that's a fascinatingly bold move for the band to take, because I just cannot, I can't imagine listening to this with even less context than I had, and just like without even the inkling that they were going to take a more electronic direction. It would just be unprecedented. And in a sense, I think it kind of is, because it was so shocking and off-putting in a sense, not necessarily in a negative sense, but like just that confrontation was very interesting.
And that's beautiful. I'm glad you said all that, because it completely touches on the feeling that the impact this album had when it dropped, the reactions to it. You have a very clear conception of who Radiohead are as a band, and that conception gets driven into the ground. Like, I mean, it gets like reinforced over and over and over through the album cycles of the bands, and particularly OK Computer. You get publication after publication after publication talking about Radiohead are this. Radiohead are the saviors of rock, or whatever kind of like byline they wanted to write, really entrenching this firm idea of what Radiohead were, what they do, into the public consciousness. And Kid A, as you've intuited, is a deliberate attempt to upend that in as dramatic a fashion as possible, while still making sense. And that I think is the crucial aspect, is that what coheres Kid A to its predecessor is that both have kind of similar thematic cores in terms of like alienation, isolation, coldness. This leans a little bit more into kind of the apocalyptic side of that. But the ways in which those core themes are explored on OK Computer versus Kid A, in basically every respect possible, is completely different. Like on OK Computer, it's very kind of clear, straightforward, storytelling-based songwriting that sometimes, as we discussed, you know, it was a bit on the nose, and sometimes it was in a charming way, and sometimes it was in a way that didn't necessarily always land for everyone. But the style with which Tom explores those kinds of ideas here, heavily influenced by his experience in the wake of OK Computer and the kind of full psychological meltdowns and brain fracturing shit that he went through, means that on Kid A, that is expressed in a much more abstract way. There's definitely something to be made of the kind of infamous way in which the lyrics for a lot of these songs, not all of them, but certain songs on this record, the most famous examples being the Everything in Its Right Place and Idioteque, the lyrics on those songs were constructed by Tom York writing these individual phrases that kind of communicated a feeling that he wanted to get at with the song, cutting those phrases up, putting them in a hat, shaking the hat around, and then just pulling the phrases out and constructing them together based on the order that they came out in. This deliberate attempt to take core ideas that he'd written and abstract them and make them as alien and as kind of confronting and weird as possible, and really put you, and why it works is that it really, for me anyway, why it works is that it really puts you immersively into his psychological mind state in a way that I truly believe he could not have done if he had approached the lyricism of this record in the same way he approached the lyricism in OK Computer. The fundamental difference in how abstraction is utilized both in that lyricism and in the combinations of sounds in these songs is fundamentally important to the effect of the record. And there's a holistic relationship between all of these elements and the way that they are used and composed and put together that is in perfect synchrony. And kind of there's a variation in emotional tone throughout this record, to be sure, but there's not so much a variation in clear topic distinctions in the way that there was on OK Computer, where you went into songs about politics and you went into songs about, you know, feeling like, you know, you want to escape and all this kinds of stuff. Whereas here it's kind of just this general soup of frantic anxiety. It's just this entirely different approach. So yeah, the first thing is you're confronted by how drastically different it sounds, but it's also just like Tom is approaching writing music in this so strange way. And you can see, I think, how that is influenced by the, for starters, the Remain in Light thing, where that was a record where David Byrne utilized improvisation and randomness very purposefully in constructing his lyricism. Like a song like Once in a Lifetime is actually constructed in a very similar way to Idioteque, where he writes these kinds of lines and then he kind of jams them together in this really abstract way. You can see that influence, and you can also see, and please tell me if I'm being too abstract here, but you can also see how the sort of influence of electronic music, the influence of texture focus, the influence of kind of like collisions of varied sound in you know, artists like Idioteque were also influencing the ways in which they were approaching piecing this record together.
I think the reference point you may be looking for in a broader sense is a lot of who is Warp Records in general, who the group have cited as a major influence during this period. So
yeah,
I think
you're right. It's not
I
just
think broadening that definition is even more contextually helpful there.
Yeah, and you're 100% right. Like obviously I bring up Idioteque first because I'm me, but like it's the wider swaths of electronic music as well. Like you can even hear some of the kind of new jazz influenced electronic music of Square Pusher and certain parts of songs like Optimistic or Morning Bell, for instance. Like they're touches, or the title track, they're touches that are sort of, the influences sort of subtly weaved in. Like for instance, I think on the title track, those really kind of compressed drums that are like really kind of heavy and noisy and almost have a kind of static quality to them reminded me a lot of the percussive sounds on Idioteque's LP5, specifically the song Ray, which I think has a kind of very sort of similar heavy percussive element. And I bring up LP5 not just because I think it's the most proximal electronic music comparison here, aside from maybe a little bit of Aphex Twin selected ambient work stuff.
Yeah, that's where my mind went for a lot of this, personally.
Yeah, so those kinds of things feed into it as well. Tom has spoken extensively of the influence of not just those direct electronic artists working in that lane, but also artists working in more familiar musical lanes that were utilizing that influence, like Bjork, for instance, and Homogenic, an album that Tom has spoken many times about being one of his favorite albums, and an album that in a kind of not dissimilar way integrates electronic influences and the way in which the singer is presented as a performer and also as this kind of like alien being themselves.
And that sense around wanting to present an alien facade is all around the aesthetic of the album, both sonic and in the packaging. Like, I'm just going to say, well, we've all been talking, so I've had a reference to the track list. I've had the backside of the vinyl looking at me, and it's one of the most, it's like Escher if it was done in Microsoft Paint, and it's just incredibly alienating. It looks normal, and then you look at the dimensions and it slowly starts to make no sense at all, and the music is like that.
Yeah, if Morgan, if you want to turn that around quickly, I would say I think this is their best album cover as well, in terms of communicating abstractly the feeling of the record, and something that actually we haven't shouted this out yet, and we really should be if we're trying to do a Radiohead deep dive, is Stanley Donwood's artwork. He's done every album cover since the Bends, I believe, and
he also did the EP, My Own Lung EP that they released before that.
Yeah, so their collaborative work started in that era, and has and Donwood is a really like interesting artist, and always comes up with very distinct artwork for every Radiohead record. There's no two Radiohead album covers that look remotely similar, and always kind of capture the mood in this very sort of chaotic way, which I love. And Kid A, I think, is the greatest example of that. Just the contrast, the sharpness of the lines of the mountains. I believe York and Donwood talked about the wanting to create this landscape that looked confronting and terrifying and threatening. The fires on the hills and just the way in which you're looking towards this mountain landscape, but there's also these kinds of like horizontal lines that are like synthetically kind of cutting through the image. It's a really powerful cover, I think, and it communicates, to me at least, quite a stark and cold feeling that the record thoroughly imbues.
I mean, it's like Unknown Pleasures level of iconic at this point.
Yeah.
I mean, shit looks like fucking Mount Doom, like especially with like up against the black sky here. It's not like nighttime black. It's like burned out atmosphere.
Yeah.
And the way that this
portrayed here.
And the way this fire is bursting up here, it's like the opening of Blade Runner, you know, where you see fires coming out of buildings like that.
Absolutely. So I think in terms of the musicality here, the place you kind of have to start is with the opening track, Everything in Its Right Place, which I think Tom described as when they came up with that was the moment where the creative spark in the process of making the album kind of came to life. And they knew instantly that this would have to be the opener, and they knew instantly that this would have to be the way in which listeners were, maybe ushered in is too polite a way of putting it, but thrown into this new template for Radiohead. And I have to say, I think this is one of the most iconic opening songs of all time. There's maybe no other opening track I've ever heard that has the sense of purpose and just clarity and complete focus and just like holy shit classic feel to it that this does. Like, it's very elegantly simple, but as soon as those synth notes come in, it's this timeless melody to me, and it's the sheer way in which the synth tone kind of fills the atmosphere, and it's kind of luscious and warm, but also like just off as well. Like
it hugs you, but it feels inherently synthetic.
Yeah.
It's perfect in welcoming you into the tone of the record, and that it embodies that alien vibe. You almost picture like the robots from the Will Smith movie I, Robot, you know, or the end of Annihilation, you know. But at the same time, it draws you in. It's enticing. The melodies are harmonious. It's asking you in. But the harmonies are also very obtuse and hard to unpick, you know.
There's dissonance in the way that the synths are layered here as well. But one thing I want to mention as well is that, and I think Tom would have spoken in this, and meeting people is easy, is that during the period where he was kind of having this full-blown psychological meltdown, he described the sensory experience that he had, where just the voices of other people and the sound of the world kind of just came together as this homogeneous drone that he wasn't really able to cut through. He described it as,
talk about that.
He calls it fridge buzz, which is actually a term that is used in the song Karma Police off of OK Computer when describing a man who buzzes like a fridge. And he uses this term.
What he says is like that OK Computer was full of fridge buzz like that.
Yeah.
And according to the line that's quoted, but what OK Computer is about is people doing fridge buzz in that way. Like, that's a very recurring theme, is people being like that. And Kid A feels like a record that wants to cut through that noise.
Well, yes, potentially. The reason I bring this up is that, I mean, obviously he said that the fridge buzz is an element of OK Computer, but to me, a lot of the drones on this record and the droning textures evoke that feeling of everything in the world around you kind of just being flattened to a dull tone that you kind of are unable to pierce through, and kind of just hangs as this constant anxious presence in your sensory experience. And on basically every single song here, there is an element of the instrumentation that serves that purpose, that hangs or buzzes or whatever in this anxious, dissonant way. And I think the heft of the synths and everything in its right place throws you into that. And that is meaningful because the song is about a panic attack. The song is about having an acute episode of severe panic and anxiety in response to literally being at a show and being unable to physically function, actually shutting down, and people trying to reach through the kind of invisible wall that your brain has layered in front of you and the rest of the world. And Tom's the kind of fragments of voices that he hears, and the kind of fragments of thoughts that he has, and the way in which his mind becomes this total kind of fragmented, dissociated mess, basically. And that is what is communicated with the abstract, cut up lyrics of this song. There are two colors in my head. Yesterday I woke up sucking on a lemon. What was that you tried to say? The abstract terms that abstract phrases that maybe evoke a certain idea or feeling, but generally cohere around this sensation of total disconnection, basically. And the way he delivers his vocals in this track, and the way he sings, and the layers of thin processing that is put on to his vocals immediately immerse you in that emotional state, I think.
Listening to this in my basement in just complete darkness was maybe the most panic, fear-inducing thing I've ever experienced from a song. The way, as you say it, the vocals are layered just on top of each other with more and more effects. As the song is going on, it feels like you're losing touch with reality in just every way possible, in terms of the physical world and just the mental world you're experiencing through sound and more abstract, specifically human concepts. It feels like ceasing to be alive. There's something so mechanical and doom and just dread filled about this song that I think really sets the tone for the album perfectly. And in a sense, I think the title can be read as like either an ironic gesture of like everything is in its right place, and that's the idea of having to just carry yourself through the day and pretend like things are okay, or it can be read as a more meta commentary on the band itself, like this being their new restructured vision. So either way you read it, I think it's a purposeful song to open with, not only in terms of content, but also just in terms of the title, in terms of just defining the greater concept of Kid A itself.
I think there's also a sense in which you can kind of interpret it as like a mantra. I think there are multiple, actually quite a few lyrical motifs across this record. They have the feeling of like mantras that Tom or whoever the character is kind of repeating to themselves over and over, almost as if they're trying to convince themselves that their state of mind is not actually the way it is, because they cannot focus on how they're actually feeling, because if they do, they will, they won't be able to recover. So it's almost a sense to me, I like both of your interpretations, but the one I kind of subscribe to is that it's like the repetition of it, of everything in its right place, is almost this trying to convince, this narrator trying to convince themselves that they are fine and that everything is going to be okay. And there is a sort of sense of sort of irony to it as well, obviously, but I feel very validated that you had that emotional response to it, August, because I also find it to be a deeply upsetting piece of music.
Yeah.
I feel like in a way it can cut both ways, where it's like, if you want it to be upsetting, it is really deeply troubling. But at the same time, if that very harmonious introduction of everything in its right place, that very harmonious introduction, if you want that to be reassuring, if you're in the middle of a panic attack, you can look at those disturbing messages and look at that as like the normal state, that the deep harmony of the song in which all of the notes are in their right places is like sheltering you from, in a way. You can look at the melody as like a haven in that way. And I think the reason it's great is that it can cut both ways like that.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely see what you mean. I think the reason I disagree is ultimately just because the song, even though it starts off in that place, becomes so disharmonious as it goes on. It becomes so layered and glitchy vocals. The layering gets more intense and distorted until it eventually kind of almost explodes at the climactic point of the song and then kind of fizzles out.
Sure.
So there's a sense to me, I don't know. I like that it's we've kind of having a bit of an opposite reaction to it, I guess.
With me, with like my problems with anxiety that I do have, even when it goes to those really dark places, it can emphasis on the possible, not certain side of that word. It can be still a moment of catharsis in a way, you know.
I wouldn't describe it as comforting, but whenever I have an attack or I feel myself on the verge of an attack, what can talk me down from that is just stimulus. Like anything that is loud and attention grabbing. And like this song, especially towards the end when it sounds like literally everything is happening in the mix, is like so it's like I said, it's stimulating, and I definitely also like the attitude of the title line sort of being a mantra, because you know these lyrics are so abstract that you can read pretty much anything you want into them, and I myself sort of read this as it's not like triumphant, but it's like acceptant after like a really long stretch of turmoil, which makes sense considering the narrative of this album's creation, this being the first song written for it and the one that really got the ball rolling. Part of that's just how musically assured it sounds, and part of that is the assertion over and over again that everything is in its right place. It is as it should be. And it's almost like you don't have to like that, but this is the way things are, and this is the way they should be. And everything else, everything involving your reaction, is an adaptation to that, a constant acclimatizing to everything around you, which is really sort of how you have to go about life with a severe anxiety disorder. You are constantly having to acclimatize yourself and adapt on the fly, unless you specifically construct your day-to-day life in a very rhythmic pattern of you do one thing and then you do the next thing and then you do that every single day. Because otherwise you are constantly being thrown new stimulus, even when it's the same activities, things go differently.
So that's another sort of reading of the title as well, like having order, just generally.
The way that the song never deviates from that one central piano melody, it only builds upon it with various soundscapes, various vocal harmonies, various production fuckery, wizardry that I still don't know how anyone did. I think that very much speaks to the way that I view the song, in that most of how one goes about their day-to-day life is in a rhythm. It's in a sort of consistent routine, but everything that is tacked onto that, every bit of stimulus, is within the song, within the sound of it, is the different things that you get thrown at you while going throughout that routine. Because regardless of how much you feel like you wake up, do the same thing every day, and then go to bed, different things do happen in that day. Small stuff you can't prepare for. I can't think of anything that speaks to that better than everything in its right place, except maybe to draw another Unknown Pleasures parallel, which I do to this album all the time for a multitude of reasons. Disorder very much gets across a very similar feeling to that. And also, in terms of great openers, that is also one that is similarly amazingly confident and assured, and just like perfectly keys you in on what the album is.
Yeah. I suppose the reason that I feel the way I do is that, to me, the first sort of stretch of this record has this kind of, the first half specifically, has this kind of almost quasi-narrative progression to it, like in an abstract way. Like there's a sense of an emotional development, and what it is that through the first couple tracks, it's kind of this simmering anxiety that then builds to a full-blown meltdown in the third track, and then kind of collapses into this kind of, I don't even know how to describe how to disappear completely, but there's this sense of an emotional progression through the first half of this record that I find intensely both upsetting and moving. And I think that the second track on the record kind of builds on the feeling of the first song in really interesting ways for me. It's a much more overtly dark and unsettling track. And it also, I think, integrates more instrumental influences into this record that kind of helps you, as you're journeying into Kid A at this point, to start to get a broader picture of what this world is. I find we've talked a lot about kind of the really kind of darker moments of Radiohead, and there are a number of them here. But I think I find Kid A, the title track, to be one of the most unpleasant experiences that Radiohead have ever kind of put to tape. It's just really fucking upsetting in a way that I find difficult to describe. So I'm just going to, it's a really instrumentally dense song. So I'll start by touching on some of those aspects of it. It has this great sort of lilting but off-kilter melodic progression that kind of feels like it's emerging out of the previous track. It has this kind of circular quality to it, but it also feels unusual and off-center in the same way as that classic melody and everything in its right place does. There's syncopation in it, and there's also kind of a spatial mixing technique that's used to kind of make it sort of move around you. And it really sets the listener on edge. You have the glitchy qualities of the opening track pursuing into here as well. And you have these bass drum parts of the song that feel kind of really anxious and skittering, even though they're quite muted. And then you have York's vocals coming through. And at this point, it's, I think, worth mentioning maybe one of the most influential pieces of tech on the creation of this record, which is a classical, not classical necessarily, but a kind of like old-fashioned electronic instrument called the Onde Martineau, which is kind of like an analog sort of keyboard creation that vaguely resembles a theremin and creates these kind of like wavering and often dissonant sounds. And this particular instrument is all over this album, but particularly in the songs Kid A, the National Anthem, and How to Disappear Completely. And what's interesting about the way it's used in the title track is that it's used not as an instrument, but as a tool to process Tom York's vocals. They're kind of fed through a vocoder effect using this Onde Martineau. And I don't actually know how it works, but basically the reason that he sounds the way he does on the song is because of that. And it's almost as though he is deliberately trying to further, like you had that kind of glitchy layering effect of his vocals on everything in its right place that made them feel kind of weird. But that's kind of the alienness, that his desire to remove the humanity from his voice really gets doubled down on this track. It's very unusual. I talked about those distorted drums that come in after that are very kind of Idioteque-esque to me. But I like the way that you can kind of hear the drumstick clacking at certain points when the drums stop. And so it's like reminds you that this is an organic drum sound that you're hearing. It's just been like lathered in sort of noise and processed in a way to make it sound like entirely digital. I love that. York is barely legible on this song, and part of the reason for that is he said that to him writing this song, the state of mind he was in when he wrote the lyrics in the song was so kind of upsetting that he didn't really want to sing them straight at all. So it continues this feel where it's almost like you're trapped inside Tom York's head, and there are these kinds of layers of distancing, alien emotion or whatever that is distancing him from the world. Like you're growing further and further apart from the natural, real, recognizable world and deeper into this kind of like alien landscape. And yeah, that is one of the big appeals of this song to me.
Yeah, well, one of the things I was trying to address earlier is like, as well as that anxiety shit, like I'm on the autistic spectrum, right? And a part of that is requiring like order and habit, right? That's part of just what comes with the brain I have. Love it. So a song like, well, the opener, which we've already talked to death, but to give another note, right? Part of what that appeals to me is it's not necessarily giving me that, but it's acknowledging that need within my head that I maybe don't like, but is there. And that's something that comes up along the whole fucking record. Whether it's the catharsis of ignoring it that comes with the national anthem, as it gets more and more fucked, or the cold and dehuman IDM of some of the later tracks. This album is something that caters to the dual sting in my head of like, wow, the autistic side of me needs order, but the anxiety side of me wants to break shit. Like the album shares that dichotomy in a way I find fascinating.
Tyler, you were talking about how sort of alienating and discomforting the song is for you. And while I totally see having that reaction to really any song on this album, as desperate as this may sound, it's like the just the classic comfort in feeling seen, I guess, because like the title track on this album is what it sounds like in my head all the fucking time. Like it's just, if it's not, you know, blasted fucking national anthem, it's this just quietly humming along, just thoughts register, but it's not long before they're gone and they're on to something else. And I find it deeply comforting, again, for the sort of the constant stimulus, similar that to what everything in its right place gives me, but also just in the way that it's like, especially when you learn how Tom feels about the lyrics and the content of the song itself, there's something really almost therapeutic in hearing a song like this that like you didn't know could translate feelings that you have all the time.
The thing about Kid A that I think mystifies me is that it's constantly in flux in how structurally unconventional it is and how it's playing with all of its really almost disparate sounds, but it's in the process of perfectly building you up to receive the next track. And like whether or not that, like, if that flow isn't like for you or you don't get on with it, I think it's undeniable that it's super indicative of the journey that York and co want to put you on. And everything in its right place sort of does this perfect, like, just from that opening kind of tone, it just sort of feels like something is interlocking, something is like, well, I mean, becoming in its right place, and you're sort of having a foundation laid. And Kid A to me is sort of the exploration of the foundation. Like you have like the building blocks of the first track, and Kid A is like, it's kind of what Morgan described of just sort of like perfectly capturing your thought process in your head. I imagine it just like, this is the track of whoever this album could be about, or about you experiencing the environment firsthand and just sort of like noting all of these things and like processing this information. And that's sort of the kind, and it's like you in and of itself, you kind of feel like you're a part of the almost like automaton like nature of this world. You kind of feel it seeping into you, but there's like a crackling, fizzing humanity that's like, it's not fully robotic, it's not fully cold. There's something there that's like glitching it out, and it's like that's sort of like the humanity is rooted in a weird level of alienation. And that's why I think, like, I like Kid A great deal. I think it's a great track. It's definitely not one of my favorite tracks on here, just because I feel like it suits more of a structural purpose. And it's like it's immediately visceral and all, but it's like it's still a track that's way more experiential, and it's not really necessarily about giving you information in the way that maybe the songs that surround it necessarily do. But in a structural standpoint, I think it's integral to understanding what this album is.
One thing about Kid A, I think I want to note, ties back to a point we made earlier, and that's, I think, the very obvious influence of Björk on this track, particularly on Homogenic, the song Alarm Call, where these two songs have this very similar kind of heavy drum pattern that gives way into this more on Alarm Call, it's more of a whistle. On Kid A, it's a bit more of a kind of synthesized piano swell. And what I find so interesting about this is the way that their influences have completely shifted and changed, and how Radiohead is incorporating something very different melodically into their music and still doing it with such an assuredness and a confidence where even if I can pinpoint the reference point, I still find it so distinctly them. And to achieve that on a complete left turn from where you were, I think is something special.
Yeah, just on the note of the synths, I meant to say this and everything when I was talking about everything at its right place, and I forgot. But to me, that synth melody reminds me of the UFO call, not the UFO call, but like the spaceship call at the end of Close Encounters of the Third Kind. It has the same sort of melodic quality to it. That dun 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 dun. It's not the same sort of thing, but it has the same sort of melodic modulation, and it works in the same way to kind of evoke that alien feel. And I think that the alien feel of that is elaborated on in a really great way in Kid A. Like, the reason why I wanted to talk about these two songs together is I think they kind of complement each other. Like, one leads into the other, and Kid A kind of build on the emotional landscape of the title track. And it is like, yeah, the title track, the first track, Everything That's Right Place, is kind of in that panic state where you're kind of like trying to overcome the kind of stimulation of that anxious episode. And then Kid A, you're actually thrust into the world, as I think someone already said. And you are unable to process or hear or understand anything around you because it sounds so strange and distorted and alien. And what I love about that synth swell toward the end of the title track is that, to me, that's another example of the music perfectly evoking that fridge buzz sensibility that York talked about, that kind of ever-present drone that is kind of hanging in your subjective experience and then occasionally kind of swells up to be overwhelming. Like, I love the way that when that synth comes in, it's too loud. Like, it's way too loud. Like, it's worryingly loud, the way it kind of comes in and just sort of almost feels like it's gonna swallow the rest of the instrumental. It is an obstruction that comes to turn the menace of the track into full-blown panic. I mean, as I see it anyway, without just blowing up the arrangement. It is a simmering tension, the intrusion of a hanging anxiety into the narrator's state of mind. And I think that it's another analog, again, another way in which what I love about this record so much is it's not just that York communicates how his state of mind and how he's feeling. It's that through the way, the instrumentation and the arrangements on this record, the band, for me anyway, put you into that subjective experience. You listen to this record and you don't just understand and empathize with Tom York. It's like you're him. You're actually feeling it. And through the music itself. And that is the greatest triumph of Kid A to me, is the way that it consistently does that in different ways. But yeah, I wanted to really give a real spotlight to that song because it gets a little bit not as talked about as some of the other songs in this record. And I think it serves a key point in escalating the tension of the album for me at this point. I know Morgan and I kind of completely disagree on the emotional tenor, which I think is quite fascinating, right? But
Yeah.
either way, it's like the feeling that's evoked for you on everything in its right place, whether it is that kind of calmness or whatever, it's kind of built upon and doubled down on in Kid A, which serves as a great way of you've been welcomed into the album and now we're pulling you deeper into it, and we're complicating it, and we're making this sonic template even stranger. So we've talked about this slow escalation, right? Whatever the feeling is, like this intensification on these first two tracks. And the National Anthem is the point in which, over these first few tracks, the overwhelming overstimulation and alien horror of this subjective experience that you're being put into becomes more and more difficult to ignore. And to me, the National Anthem is like the fullest realization of this. And I love that it's titled the National Anthem. I could see perhaps interpreting that in a political way, but to me, it's a title that suggests that the noise of this track is intended to represent the constant state of things, the abstruse sound that we are submitted to by being alive, just the general cacophony of existence. It's not a society thing. It's not a political thing. It is a being alive thing. Like, this is the song we sing. This is the noise we are subjected to. The landscape of what this album is musically is almost like constantly being elaborated on in a different way with each successive track. Like, we've had so much electronic stuff. We've had organic stuff like drums that have been processed in a way. And now we have bass. Like, well, not that this is the first point in which bass is used on the album. It's definitely on the title track. But the crunching bass line of this song is like so fucking grimy. It's just wrong. Like, it is absolutely just bone chilling as soon as it comes in.
I mean, it sounds like it would fit on like The Sound of Perseverance or something.
Yeah, right.
I think like those bass tones are a little cleaner, actually.
Yeah, it's like a fucking no wave bass tone, right? It could fit in like on like a 90s, like 80s Swans record or a Glenn Branca sort of thing. Like, it's a really just ugh. And then the way in which the instrumentation and the use of the brass band is layered on top is kind of just, it perfectly again simulates that overwhelmingness. It has a similar sort of progression to me as Everything in Its Right Place, where everything is just intensifying more and more and more as the song goes on.
I find just about every song on this album comforting in its own right. And part of that's the fact that I've been listening to it for close to 10 years now and just have so acclimated and am so enamored with it still, except the National Anthem, an outlier sonically on the album, which is like part of its appeal, I think, especially coming in at track 3, as it just never lets you acclimate to what this album even is.
So I could see this song being critiqued potentially for like its singular devotion to just the idea of escalating chaos. But I mean, I don't know. To me, that is a feeling that is conveyed so effectively and so singularly here that it almost feels like a definitive example, a definitive musical representation of that. But I'm curious, August, to see where you fall on this particular song, because I could see it being polarizing.
Well, this quickly worked its way up as being one of my favorite songs they've done. The escalation of the horror and tension up to this point in the album, I think, is just crushing. And I think that very simple looping bass line does a great job at just right from the word go, just completely overwhelming you in a sensory regard. The lyrics here, it feels like just feeling alone in a crowd, I think is what I got from it. The idea of everyone is so near, and that just felt so like lonely somehow. And not in like a sense of like, oh, everyone is so near, literal physical distance, but also like in the sense of just the chaos and the overwhelming nature of the world itself, I think, kind of conveying that emotion to me also. So
I think it's meaningful to learn that when they were conducting the horn section on this track, the instructions they gave were sound like a traffic jam.
That's fascinating.
Based.
And so yeah, it's like it's that thing with with kind of free jazz influenced stuff where it's like it seems like it's pure chaos, but I think this is a kind of good introduction to that mindset of orchestrating that sort of music, because you get a sense of the escalation within it, and there's this great contrast between the individual horn tones of the various players and the ways in which some of them are kind of like really kind of some of the horn tones are really kind of like squirrely and others are really like kind of fat, and it just has this real sense of like it's gonna sound stupid, but it's like real like geometry and shit in the way that all of these sounds are kind of hitting against each other. Nothing fits together like you would normally expect with, you know, a musical arrangement where the shapes of the sounds lock into place. Everything is kind of like bouncing up against each other, and it's really great. And I also want to shout out as well, just as part of the kind of narrative of this, is that when Radiohead, one of the few kind of TV appearances that Radiohead did to promote this album after its release was to play SNL. And I want you to, I mean, I've already kind of given the game away here, but the two songs that they played on SNL were Idioteque and this song. And this song in particular,
cannot imagine anything more based.
This song in particular, the performance of this song is etched into my mind. It's one of the great, I think, TV show performances of all time, because as you can imagine, go a show like SNL and then just like the band just launching into this. I think from memory, they play it at a faster tempo as well, which I think they often do when they perform it live, which just, hold on to your fucking seats. And it's just awesome with the SNL band improvising over top of the track, and Tom literally losing his mind, as you would expect he would have to really commit to the performance here. It's so emblematic of the chaos that people think of when they think of this album, and it's just an absolute fucking rip roarer. I mean, yeah, it's so unfathomably based, as Morgan said. There's really no other way of putting it.
To make a comparison that is going to bring very big comparing the Mountain Ghost to Steely Dan energy here. What it reminds me of, and say it with me, kids, is the Dillinger Escape Plan, especially Calculating Infinity. By like the back half of this track, it's so like it's orchestrated to sound like a car crash, which is like the entire sonic template of something like Calculating Infinity. They just traded out guitars for horns, and it's like that level of insane. And like I would imagine if you sped up the last half of the National Anthem like 2x speed and pitch shifted it along with it, it would sound like Calculating Infinity, just to such a degree that it would like tone of instruments becomes illegible. It's just noise and the most fucking Looney Tune shit you've ever heard.
The National Anthem reaches this kind of like just chilling climax, like that part at the very end of the song where all of the horns kind of just like come together for one last kind of burst is really like, ugh. It's like I physically recoil when that happens. It's so unpleasant. And then the song kind of chews itself up and evaporates. And then we get, pause for impact, the best Radiohead song. And this is the moment where the record starts to make sense. And I don't mean that in the sense that, oh, this is the moment where the record starts to sound more like conventional or whatever. It's not what I mean at all. And I don't really think I think it's kind of a reductive thing to say anyway. But this is the moment where this is the moment where the chaos that precedes it starts to become clear what the purpose is. And it starts to become clear the world that's being created is not just an album about, how fucking alien the world is. It's about how fucked it is to psychologically experience that. It really is about, it's really where I think it becomes absolutely clear that this is a record about an immersive subjective experience rather than about depicting a chaotic landscape. And so I think it's meaningful that the very first time on this album that you hear Tom's voice without any vocal processing or alteration is when he sings the line, "That there, that's not me." And I have to say, when that happens, I get choked up. I cannot listen to this song anymore without crying. That the impact of that moment when you suddenly hear his voice unadorned and gentle, as opposed to anxious or panicked or distorted or fucked up, and he's reflecting on the previous 3 tracks to say that to make it clear that the what he has described in those songs is his experience of the world, but it isn't him. Like I'm making it sound like more simplistic than it is, but it's a very powerful moment. And I talked about how my interpretation of everything in its right place is that it describes like the experience of having a panic attack and how like the subjective stimulus of that. And I think How to Disappear completely literalizes that more. It's specifically written in reference to the experience of having a panic attack during live performances, as Everything in Its Right Place arguably is. And the lyrical motif here of "I'm not here, this isn't happening," which is so fucking heartbreaking for its simplicity, is actually, again, I come back to this notion of lyrical mantras on this album. It's actually a mantra that Michael Stipe of REM gave to Tom York when Tom asked for advice with dealing with performing live with this level of, expectation and audience and all that sort of thing. He said, "Repeat to yourself, I'm not here, this isn't happening." So this, again, that literalization of Tom's state of mind, that clarification that what you're experiencing is his, as a documentation of his experience, is really brought home there by that lyric and the significance of it. Beyond just the lyrics, which I'm sure we can dig into some more, the sound of the song. This song features the loneliest sound ever recorded, which is that I'm not sure whether it's a string swell or whether it's Onde Martineau. I think it could be Onde Martineau. Actually, I think Onde Martineau might be the hanging drone in the back of it that you hear instantly in the first second of the song. That really dissonant tone that's very kind of upsetting. But then there's this string swell that you all know what I mean. That sound is heartbreaking. It's fucking just, oh man. And again, it's like structurally, song is not all that dissimilar to How to Disappear completely. It's almost exactly the same length, and it has the same sense of escalation and the intrusion of dissonance and chaos. And just the fucking moment in this song where he gives up speaking and just vocalizes along with that string swell is, again, I don't know how to describe it without using hyperbole. It just insert that here. It is simply too real to fucking process, and it just hits home in this way that is both beautifully powerful in and of itself as a song. Like, you can listen to the song in isolation and feel that, but coming at this point on the record as a kind of climax of this album's first half, it is just emotionally devastating.
I'm going to talk about the time me and Jake saw them live a handful of times in this video, because they played half of this album in order. They played Kid A, and then later Everything in Its Right Place, and then the National Anthem, then Idioteque, and then How to Disappear Completely as the last song before the first encore. And like, I can't talk about this song. I don't know how to. Like, and I can illustrate that with the fact that when we saw them and they played it, I fully fucking disassociated. An out of body experience implies that you're sort of looking at yourself from a different angle, like it's happening to someone else. And it's like, that's not even it. Because it's like you're not even seeing anything. It's like you've just left your body and you don't see anything. You just, the stimulus is what has been thrust upon you, and that's the only thing you can take in, and that proves to be too much. And I think that's fitting, just because I feel like that's what the song is about.
Yeah,
it's too much, and you have to pull away.
Like when August talked about National Anthem and that feeling of like being alone but like surrounded, everyone is so near, and then the lyric in the song about like floating down the Liffey, which is an Irish river, that idea, that literalization of leaving your body here, it's like a beautiful response to the previous track where, and because the protagonist is unable to deal with that stimulation in the world, there's this actual just like literal disassociation, this exit from the body that happens in this song, that it feels like the only possible response to the previous track in a certain sense when I think about it like that.
It also reminds me of the moments where you come down from a panic attack, and it's almost like euphoric. It's that level of numbness, almost just single-minded calm, but like it's not necessarily a positive feeling.
I love the part in the song where Tom ceases to communicate clear ideas outside of that, I'm not here, this isn't happening. Like at start, he like talks about, I walk through walls, I float down the Liffey, in a little while I'll be gone. And then after that, he kind of just ceases to paint a clear picture. And I love the strobe lights and blown speakers, fireworks and hurricanes.
That's such a good image.
Because immediately that puts you, like, that's abstract, right? Those are just abstract visual images, but also like you can totally see how he's on stage and the strobe lights and the blown speakers are like fireworks and hurricanes respectively in his experience, and he only needs to communicate that by just saying those words disassociated from any context. It's very, very effective, a very, very powerful literary motif.
Yeah, it's like having played a handful of very energetic live shows in my life as someone in the band. The way I would describe it is like just letting someone else drive the car for a while. I just have to rely on muscle memory and the thing that I've practiced 1,000 times when I'm on stage, because if I think about the fact that I'm on stage and there are God knows how many people, whether it's 50 or whether it's 5, if I think about that, I'll have to leave. So I just don't. I just let the muscles take over and run through everything that I had practiced for so long. And I think How to Disappear Completely, especially when you consider that it is about having to perform live, it's really illuminating in that sense of just like you don't feel like a person when you're up there.
So there's this arc I keep coming back to because it's just how I understand the album now. This is to me one of the premier examples of the album form. It is fully realized. I remember distinctly saying when we started this series that one of the things that Radiohead contributed the most to, the way in which like a lot of popular artists go about making music is their dedication to the format of the album and their consideration of format and what it means beyond just like how you put the songs together. And another interesting detail, behind the scenes detail, is that this has happened on multiple Radiohead albums. The decision on the track listing and the sequencing for this album was so heated that the band apparently came this close to breaking up entirely just over it. They were serious. They said, like, if we can't figure out how to do this, like, they had the songs. If we can't figure out how to do this, it's over. That was literally it. And that happened on In Rainbows as well, which we'll be able to talk about when we get to that record too. So, and we will also reflect, we might reflect more on this in the next week's episode as well, but the notion of like selecting the songs for this record from the large batch they had. My point being that Kid A, the album, is a masterful exercise in the art of sequencing and how sequencing can elevate individual songs above just, you know, how they function as songs to how they function as a part of a tapestry. And in that sense, Treefingers is the perfect inclusion on this record at the point where it comes. You've had the chaotic panic of the National Anthem. You've had the literal dissociation from the body of how to disappear completely. And then you have, it's like the spirit has continued floating throughout that song. And now you get into this track where it's like you're almost in a completely different world. My favorite detail of Treefingers is that this song is created entirely using a single guitar and effects that are applied to it. I'm not joking.
Yep.
This song, you're me last night when he told me this.
Yeah, it's just like My Bloody Valentine. It's just like My Bloody Valentine levels of effects pedals and studio meddling.
This is Ed O'Brien's kind of crowning achievement as a musical contributor up to this point in their career anyway.
Christ.
Is his ability to create the tone of this song and just create this entire song just using his guitar and, as Morgan says, effects pedals and various kinds of additional tools. He creates this entire landscape, and I think it's heavily, I mean, this might be an obvious point of reference, but to me this is heavily indebted to Brian Eno. Like it's very, very reminiscent of specifically Another Green World. That particular landscape on that record, which is evoked very clearly by this track. And to me, this is not just, hey, let's put in a Brian Eno ambient interlude. It's very purposefully included. It's definitely an intermission sort of track coming in the middle and following that climactic, just harrowing experience that's preceded it. But it's also just this kind of transfer. To me, it's like dying. It's like a cocoon state where you are moving through this purgatorial landscape to this new world that is then literalized in the second half of the album.
Especially considering all of the songs that come after it, it feels like resignation, I guess, just an acceptance of the way that things are, because, and then following that, a sort of ironic, caustic turn on it, on the state of things, the state of the way one feels at all times, especially with Optimistic coming right after it.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is the track that got me into ambient music.
I mean, even calling it ambient almost feels like it's slightly underselling it a bit. Like it ostensibly is what it is, but there's so much richness and intricacy in this. Like it's ostensibly those repeating, oscillating and modulating chords that is actually like less repetitive than it's always less repetitive than I remember it being, which is a beautiful surprise of it. But then there's these great sort of like sounds that come in at certain parts of it where it's like this kind of, I don't even know how to describe it. It's just so three-dimensional, if that makes any sense. Like, again, it's that thing where this album puts you into the subjective experience and creates this world unto itself that you are not having described to you, but you're being made to experience. That's the power of it as this kind of wordless ambient interlude. It feels like a the chaos and the craziness and the meltdown of the first half of this album reaches this fever point, and then you just kind of you've died, like, and you're moving into this afterlife or to this new world. I don't know if it sounds ridiculous, but that to me is what it is. And then it's like, it's still quite subjective, but the second half of this album is largely more about the world itself and the place that this person goes to once they kind of cross over.
You know, the Pitchfork Kid A review, not to harp on that, is a terrible review, but it's also something the album invites. Just by its very nature, is this sort of like super abstract way of talking about it.
It becomes really difficult to describe, and so it's very like, how do you describe that? And I can see the temptation, especially when it's released, to kind of lean into just the most radical, weird descriptions of it. But yeah, anyway.
Morgan, you kind of hinted at something that I think is like sort of the key to, like, if I could somehow try to explain why Kid A is the album that it is and why it has the reputation that it does and just like what it means. It's Kid A is not the achievement that it is because it's this great untouchable album that, you know, you could say all the, you know, oh, this Radiohead song was like a dead baby in IMAX. No, it's not because it's good. It's because it works. It's purely by the fact that it does not fail that it succeeds. And that's not as like, that sounds inherently condescending, but it's really, really not. It's really more to the fact that it's like, I feel like engaging with something like this is completely different than engaging with something like OK Computer, is that it's like, it's not even that the fact that it's like, oh, it's a departure. It's just, I don't listen to Kid A the same that I listen to another Radiohead album in like a broad term. Like I can listen to Deadwing and I can listen to Fear of a Blank Planet, and I largely engage with those albums on the same level. You know, they're the same band, they're similar eras of that particular sound, but the thing with Kid A is that it's like almost purely empathic in how it, like, you really do feel like the ghost in the machine of Tom York. It's like being put, like, if you don't have an anxiety disorder, listen to this and that's what it feels like. You just sort of have this ebb and flow of like pure chaos and then sort of elation, and then you go kind of like right back to experiencing that weird flux, and it just doesn't feel like anything is definite. Everything feels fluid and weird.
Yeah, I think maybe the best explanation for the infamous Pitchfork Kid A review, just to put it a bit more clearly than I did before, is that this album is so alien. Like, yeah, there's clear reference points that you can pick up on, but really nothing else before it sounds like it. It's not just new for Radiohead. It's the combination of sounds here and the way that they're used is so difficult to describe. There's just so little real precedent for it. And that's not me, sucking its fucking dick. It's just me describing. It's not inherently positive either.
No,
to say that.
It's a neutral statement.
You were stating a fact.
But yeah, and so I mean, the fact that we're having a lot of difficulty describing some of these songs, I think, speaks to that.
Like, how do you do that with Treefingers? Like, this is one of my favorite songs on the album. It's one of my favorite Radiohead songs. I can't tell you anything about this. It's like, I don't know. Until like a week ago, I thought that this was constructed out of like some weird esoteric synth pad or something. Yeah. And then Tyler's like, fuck it, he just made it with one guitar. And I'm like, well, I guess I'll go fuck myself then.
Yeah, I think the greatest kind of testament to this record is that in isolation, this is a pleasant enough, ambient piece that, is like, but it feels integral on the album.
To me, it reminds me of almost like a chiming bell, which is originally what I thought the song was constructed from, albeit heavily reverberated it to some sense. And I think that the way the track, to me, it almost feels like lapping water, ebbing and flowing back and forward. Right. And almost like a tree branch, if we're going to be a little literal with the title, the expansion and contraction at various points that growing outward from one central location. It feels like a very holistic, lively kind of moment in the record, I think. And I would say, I think it serves kind of, as this conclusion of sorts to the first half, where How to Disappear completely being the climax, this being the denouement, if you want to use a theater term.
Yeah, beautifully put. The second half of Kid A, you have passed through this continuous sort of landscape of the first 5 tracks, and then you're kind of anchored into this more familiar territory for Radiohead. You get prominent electric guitar, you get an arrangement that feels, I wouldn't say akin to the arrangements of an album like OK Computer or anything, but it feels like a grounding in a new world that the second half of this album represents. And again, this is another example of a song that is built around a mantra. In this case, a mantra that York's partner, Rachel Owen, gave to him when he was really at the worst in terms of the writer's block on this album. You can try the best you can. The best you can is good enough. That's kind of maybe a bit of a simplistic statement, but the way it becomes used in the song becomes quite kind of effective and powerful, and the way that it is contrasted as well with the rest of the lyrics on this record, which kind of, again, more lean into, whereas the first part of the record was describing sort of subjective experience, the second half of the record describes more the landscape itself, in these very kind of vivid ways that are quite pessimistic and dark and literate, and really contrast heavily against that hook. I'm very curious to hear what you all think of this song.
Oh, I honestly found this one of the most difficult things to overcome in my listens of this record, because I guess, quite frankly, being so immersed in the narrative and world of that first half, it was a little tough to kind of get into this, quite honestly, because in a sense the record has subverted itself in going for something that's quite different. I do really love how tribal the drums sound on this song. I think that pattern is really just viscerally kind of exciting in a sense, but lyrically it's written in what feels a very different way, with the song having much more defined verses and choruses, which it's a weird thing to complain about, in a sense, a song having a defined structure, but it really does catch me off guard in really in a way I'm not sure how much I like. But one thing I do want to note as a lyrical theme I think is interesting, this mention of dinosaurs roaming the earth, which I think is a very intentional narrative seed the band are planting early into this second story arc of sorts. And I like that a lot, and I think that's what really makes this track feel like it's of a piece and has purpose with the rest of the album. But I don't know, I'm just a little kind of lost on it myself, frankly.
If I can kind of offer a little more, I don't know, an alternate perspective on this track, maybe, or at least an elaboration. To me, this song is less of a radical lyrical shift than perhaps August feels it is, at least in my perception. There's a real sense of like that chopped up nature to the lyricism here. Like lines are kind of abstractly placed next to each other, especially towards the end of the song as well. And there's a sense of like, sometimes there'll be a logical thread between one line and the next line, and there'll be a rhyme scheme that's utilized at certain points. But there'll always be a sense of disconnect between one thing and the next thing that's being said. The big fish eat the little ones, not my problem, give me some. I'd really like to help you, man. Nervous, messed up marionette floating around on a prison ship. Like some lines are kind of these short little fragments and other lines are these kind of vivid little images. And to me, they're kind of pieced together in this really sort of haphazard way, which is in keeping to me with the rest of the album and with the other songs. It's more kind of overtly about the landscape in a way that, you know, previous tracks on this record haven't been. But to me, it's kind of a welcome shift into kind of crafting a clearer picture of this kind of alien landscape.
And I think maybe that's what I'm trying to get at a bit more of that definition that's introduced in this track might be what's keeping me away for a bit. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is worth saying that, like, even on OK Computer, which was a weird album for Radiohead at the time, this put like something like Optimistic on that album would be like fucking weird. Like, especially in like the last, I don't know, 30 seconds of it, where it
goes like full
down.
jazz breakdown.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that part.
Yeah. And also worth shouting out that this is some of Phil Selway's best work on this
Absolutely.
song.
Yeah, as August already pointed out, with the very kind of distinctive tribal drum atmosphere. I also want to shout out as well, something I kind of got at before but didn't really clearly explain, is the ironic juxtaposition in this song. Like there's very cynical verses here about like a systematic structure in this world that is, you know, it's actually not dissimilar to some of the sentiments expressed on songs from OK Computer, like Paranoid Android, for instance. You know, this one's optimistic, this one went to market, this one just came out of the swamp, this one drops a payload, fodder for the animals living on Animal Farm. That real fatalistic sense of like the structure of this world from its interior foundations is corroded. And then the chorus comes in, you can try the best you can is good enough, which is like coming after that, it's kind of meaningless. It's like, because the verses suggest that this is a system that is built corrupted and built fundamentally to poison, and you can't really play along with it and expect to, you have to overthrow it entirely. But the chorus yet suggests the opposite. It's this weird sort of ironic chorus where it's almost like it's parroting the sentiments expressed by the forces that create this landscape. Like, yeah, sure, if you try the best you can. That's that fucking conservative thing where it's like, you know, you need to fucking, it's all about hard work and shit. And
pull yourself up by the bootstraps.
Yeah, I love that sense of real fucking just vicious irony and vicious sarcasm in that contrast. It's really fucking dope, in my opinion.
Yeah, it sounds to me like it's like they took a line from Fitter Happier and made a song around it. The best you can is good enough sounds like the thing that fucking Amazon will be slapping on their boxes in 10 years when they're the only company.
Yeah. We should talk about the way in which the kind of jazzy conclusion of the song kind of just runs against this brick wall of the intro of In Limbo, which is a really interesting song. I think another one, probably the biggest grower on this record, in my opinion, and another perfect example of, again, how sequencing elevates individual moments into more than the sum of their parts, essentially. I love, again, how this song has these kind of dreamy guitar tones that feel like a carryover from parts of the last record, but are just used differently here. It's like a landscape constructed entirely of these swirling, watery guitar tones, in the same sense that Treefingers is a landscape constructed entirely of these solemn and you know, guitar tones in their own right. So again, you have that abstracted lyricism that communicates a general feeling without very much sort of specificity. I'm very curious to hear everyone's takes on this track and how it kind of fits into the progression of the album at this point.
First thing I want to note is I love the main melodic line of this song, that guitar line that seems to be ascending up the scale, but it does it in such an uncomfortable way that I really love, where it feels like it goes on for an extra 2 or 3 notes before dropping back down. And I think, and that's so fascinating. I really loved that. This song is really haunting and mesmerizing, and coming after Optimistic, I find it really, really weird, kind of like it almost feels like a refutation of the reality established on Optimistic, this more optimistic
You're
being
living
this
in a fantasy.
yeah. And also just musically, these songs sounding very different from each other, and that, yeah, you're living in a fantasy part obviously being a core tenor of this, kind of making the world out to be this fake faux place where it's just a bunch of people like putting on a smile or whatnot, is what In Limbo evokes. That title also feeling very important to me, to this song's purpose in the album. This just state between life and death, where you're living your day-to-day life, but so little is changing it. You may as well be dead because it just doesn't matter.
Yeah, in a sense, it's like optimistic is the presentation of the world. Like it's a description of the world from the perspective of someone within it, but it's also this kind of presentation of the world in the way that the powers that be want it to be seen. And then In Limbo is like you're zeroing into the reality of it from the perspective of someone who is immersed within it. It's that's to me how the two songs are related, is that Optimistic kind of throws you into this world and the way that it is kind of presented, and then In Limbo is like a zeroing in on the emotional state of living in it. I like the way in which Tom York described his fascination with Limbo in an interview related to this as well, like and the way that relates to the use of the sounds in the mix on this as well, like they're at points being like sounds that were meant to evoke like voices that can't get out, voices that are stuck and trapped and suspended in this state and rising through it. Like there's a great use of overlapping vocals in this song and just a real sense of swirling disorientation. That key melodic motif, August, that you talked about is so great because of exactly what you said. It's so fucking unusual and unsettling. It almost feels like it doubles back onto itself in a way that feels so inconclusive and just kind of upsetting. And the way it's kind of all multi-tracked as well, to have this kind of like just really ballooning sound to it is great. And then the way that the song kind of just boils over and collapses towards the end of it as well. You get this kind of like garish sound coming through it, and the way that Tom York's vocals are processed on the refrain of "Come Back." It's it's kind of like similar to me in effect as that garish synth coming in towards the end of the title track. It's like this kind of boiling over happening that ends the song in a really kind of like frantic state that I think is quite potent. And then you go into one of the record's most singular and popular and kind of talked about songs, Idioteque, which is where the influence of IDM is most pronounced on this entire album and is probably the most kind of dramatic change from anything that Radiohead have ever done before. I have a lot of thoughts on this song and I have a long relationship with it. But because of how much of a curveball it is, I want to once again move straight to August here. I have to know what your experience was encountering this song and how you feel about it.
Well, this is another one where I remember how I felt about it on the first time very vividly. I mean, picture this: you're listening to this album for the first time. You've heard the 7 songs up to now. You're me, and then they go into this gigantic swell. That first swell in the song is where I was like, "Oh, holy shit!" It was like magical in a sense, hearing that for the first time and just feeling like that particular sound that they use that particular tone is something I've heard a lot on kind of IDM projects from the time, but I don't think I've ever heard anything executed this well. And it's a sound which I could almost see feeling cheesy on another album, but I think here it works so well in combination with the drums in the background. And it really lets you soak into that just proper IDM aspect of it, which is very well done. And I love that Radiohead give you time to properly absorb it as an IDM song rather than just like a Radiohead song, because it makes the entrance of the vocals so cathartic. The who's in a bunker part coming in at about a minute in, and it's just like, whoa. It's I don't know, it was like just an overwhelmingly exciting song. And it's also the song where the second half kind of really began to fall into place for me, and what this all was getting at, this apocalyptic end of the world lyricism, evoking like a nuclear holocaust of the world, and rushing and having to rush to a bunker for safety, but also getting caught up in the I have to hear both sides part.
Ice Age coming, let me hear both sides. It's very prescient.
Hell.
It's very
like,
prescient.
Yeah, I mean, I can't even describe how well this all convalesces into this one perfect blaring image in front of you, and I think it's amazing. Maybe my favorite song from them so far.
Yeah, this is the creation of this song is kind of indicative of, you know, the record as a whole. This is the classic example of that I mentioned earlier, that technique of taking these sort of writing these phrases for the song, cutting them up, and then just sort of like randomly selecting their order to abstract the sentiment rather than expressing it in a clear and linear way, deliberately abstracting it to induce that alien sensation that makes it so, that adds so much to the emotional impact of it, to the disorientation, to the fear, and to the just general like emotionally overwhelming quality that it has. It's a song that's full of lines where you might not even know why they make you feel the way you do, but they just make you feel something really strong. And what I like is that I think the song actually does a really good job of resisting a clear interpretation. Like we, as people, have the obvious desire to impose a clear interpretation on music. And over the years with the song, since I've been a teenager, I've tried to do that. But it resists that. Like it has these images that suggest what the things that you've talked about, August, as well. But you can never really kind of be exactly clear about what is happening in this song. I love the mixture of the contrast of very straightforward and almost kind of like, yeah, cliche sentiments like women and children first, with pure surrealism and lines like "I laugh until my head comes off." Just horrific imagery in this song, and that repetition of "here I'm allowed everything all of the time." I don't know why that sends chills down my spine, but it feels fucking terrifying.
To me, it evokes this idea of like just someone who kind of has no need to worry about anything and is kind of callously casting everything else away, and that would seem to fit in line with the previous themes on Optimistic and in Limbo, kind of almost taking the opposite perspective from in Limbo.
What's great about it is like I to me it's like a weird surrealistic fusion of the perspectives of the last two songs. So both the perspective of the selfish, those in power, and the perspective of the subjugated, and to kind of communicate those ideas in a way that is in concert with the rest of the album. They're just kind of mashed together in this really surreal clashing and just colliding of phrases and sounds and ideas, and that chaos is obviously reflected in the musical arrangement as well. The deliberately dance club evoking beat, which is slathered in distortion to sound so fucking weird and off kilter and strange, and then those kind of just ghostly melodic tones that hang over this song. They're great. They're both upsetting in terms of like the emotion that the melody makes you feel, and also kind of like just chilling in the way that at the end of the melodic refrain, that last note is so intense and like the way it kind of hangs on that. The dynamic shit is great. It reminds me a lot of the melody of Idioteque's Ray, and I just had to put that in there as well because both melodies are similar to me.
I knew this was the song you were gonna mention, LP5, and it's the one I thought of too.
It's the second song I've mentioned.
One he's done that for.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. So it's like the drums on the percussion on Ray is, and I still believe Ray is one of the most influential IDM songs of the 90s. The percussion on Ray is very similar to the percussion on Kid A, and the melodic motif in that song is very similar to the melodic motif in this song. But yeah, you're absolutely right about everything about the way in which the arrival of Tom as a vocalist is delayed and the impact of that. And especially when he comes in and he's so, his tonality is so frantic. It's just so upsetting.
I just feel the need to iterate, especially with considering the context of the album it's on. What a fucking banger. Like, god damn. Just fucking wanna go fight somebody or something. I just like it gets the juices flowing.
It gets the people going. In the same way that Optimistic is kind of like a subversion of the rock song template with its dark lyricism, to me, this song is kind of like a subversion of the club banger. Like it is ostensibly a banger in the same way that Optimistic is ostensibly a rock song with a really kind of straightforward melody. But there's elements to both tracks that pervert that template, whether it's the lyricism of Optimistic or whether it's the literally everything about Idioteque. It takes that basic club beat template and strips it down so that you have this distinct repetitive percussive thing, this distinct repetitive melodic thing that are kind of happening in synchrony. It's very kind of minimalist, actually, if you think about it.
It's really two core elements.
Yeah, it's super effective.
Tom 3.
And just the way that his vocals get chopped up in the outro of the song as well. There's something about that just really sends a shiver down my spine. I know it's chopped up, but I sometimes when I listen to it, I hear him say the first of the children, which would be sort of relevant to the title of the album. And sometimes I hear the children come first. And every time I listen to it, it's almost like I hear that differently. And I understand that it's just chopped up vocals. It doesn't mean anything. But the way that my brain tries to impose meaning on it there is kind of reflective of the way that my brain tries to approach this whole song.
Is it perhaps purposeful that they choose to chop up the line, the children first, when the next song has the lines, cut the kids in half. Yeah.
This
album's as good as a dead baby.
This what I think particularly gets me about that the children come first, that's fucking, in the context of this song, that shit is fucking dark. Like it's this idea of like
Jesus Christ,
it's this idea of like literally, it's like this idea of literally like when I hear that, I'm like imagining some dude like throwing kids into a fireplace or something, or like off of the fucking Titanic, because the women and children first thing always makes me think of Titanic. It's like that. It's just, yeah. And just also like the sound at the very end of this song that leads into Morning Bell, that kind of dissonant droning in the background, it sounds like a fucking death camp scream. Like it sounds like it's just fucking terrifying. It sounds like every single fucking person in the bowels of hell screaming in unison, House That Jack Built style. It's just fucking dark as shit. And the way that flows into Morning Bell is so dope as well, with those just contrast, because you've had that distorted fucking glitched out beat in your ear for 5 minutes, and then you get the crisp, clean drumming coming in at the start of Morning Bell. That shit is serotonin, which is ironic considering that the songs themselves are very much not serotonin. It's hard not to be repetitive at this point, because the beautiful thing about the structure of this album is that it's consistent in what it does, and it explores, you know, the chopped up vocals thing. Like it's continued over from Idioteque here, in the sense that in both these songs, the randomness of the way the lines collide with each other is very noticeable and clearly intentional. What I particularly love about this song is that while Idioteque is kind of this just horrific apocalyptic depiction of this kind of like Dante's Inferno, like fucking just feast of death and flesh, Morning Bell is kind of comparatively mundane in what it depicts, but it takes that mundane nature of like existing, and it fucks that shit up with lines like cut the kids in half, and just the general tone of the way that everything collides in this song. It follows
I
that.
think this is another really interesting kind of turn in what the album is going for, because it seems where Idioteque was focused on kind of conveying this grand world-ending scene and scenario, Morning Bell is communicating something much more quaint, almost much more like human and down to earth, kind of at least the imagery it immediately evoked to me was like a divorce or separation of some kind. This idea of objects being strewn about across the front lawn. I almost feel the purpose of that, whether it is divorce or not, I think the idea is to perhaps convey the same kind of brokenness and lack of wholeness that the previous three songs have done on a more macro, like societal level, and here take it to more of a personal level, perhaps, is how I read it.
Absolutely, I have the same sort of interpretation. In many ways, this feels like one of the most ephemeral tracks on the album, which I guess I can see why, you know, a lot of people cite it as maybe one of their least favorites, or a track that doesn't necessarily resonate in the same way, because it pushes the abstraction to this real kind of limit. Like you get the sense, like you've said, that it is about it is depicting this more kind of interpersonal landscape, but it is also just so like just abstract again. The collisions of lines here are less kind of coherent and affecting that in this than Idioteque are, but that's not to the track's detriment, I don't think. It just to me it just it creates that sense of a fractured, broken social landscape, and it actually kind of the joys of it to me are quite simplistic, and just the sheer effect of it, of lines like cut the kids in half, of the repetition of lines like where'd you park the car, that sense of like dissociation and like kind of being this mundane, trivial experience that comes to stand in as a representation for the general sort of ennui of living in this world. Like it's beautiful and simple, but that simplicity is to its benefit, I think. And to move away from the lyricism, The arrangement of the track as well is gorgeous. It has electric pianos that sound rich and so beautiful. But it also, again, has this climax towards the end that I absolutely love. The way the drums quicken and it kind of builds up into this kind of swelling, like collisions of watery sounds in a similar way to In Limbo, actually. But with that kind of beat giving it this kind of additional thrust. I absolutely love the swelling end of this track. And there's something really kind of unsettling about the way that by the end of the song, Tom is literally just whispering, walking, 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 over and over and over and over again. Like the surreal collisions of scenes and of experiences it's kind of just like devolved to the point where it's just one word, mundane fragment of the scene that doesn't even give you the whole picture anymore. That's really effective to me. And I think is also reflected in the way that the actual climax itself kind of falls apart at the very end and you're just left with that bass line and electric piano melody. It's very, I can't fault this song at all, personally. I think it's really effective. That leads us into, I think, one of the oldest songs on this record in terms of like when Tom originally wrote it, but also one of the ones that if you listen to early demos of this track, there are a few very rare ones out there. It has radically transformed, as one might imagine. The song Motion Picture Soundtrack, which is, I mean, this record is full of curveballs and full of surprises, but I gotta say, August, I'm sure you were not expecting this album to end on a harmonium-led ballad.
I mean, how could I? Like, by this point in the track list, when this happened, I was like, you know what? Fuck it. Anything can happen. I can't even say I'm caught off guard by this because that would have me expecting something consistent at this point, and obviously
that's a good mindset to keep for Amnesiac too.
Yeah.
all right.
And then rainbows.
The thing about this song that I want to lead off this discussion with is we've had so much synthetic shit on, like, not shit, but like synthetic stuff on this album, right? Synthetic tones and like a real like clinical coldness. And just when you hear the thumping of the harmonium in this song and just the real organic feel of it, there's something about the appearance of that is kind of devastating. Again, with Morning Bell, you're brought back into the world of the interpersonal but still kind of filtered through this surreal, cut up landscape. And then that builds so beautifully into this kind of tone poem, eulogy song that ends the album in this incredibly emotional state of mind. This is one of the most difficult songs for me to talk about on the album as well, because it's so simple, and so kind of almost cute in a certain sense, but like devastating as well. There's just something about the melody here that gets me, the vocal melody on I Think You're Crazy. Oh God, yeah, it there's a quaintness to the lyricism here too. It's more direct and beautiful, and it's kind of like a sentiment from one person to another. And it is kind of like, and that it's meaningful that it ends on that line of "I will see you in the next life." I need to gather my thoughts on this one, but I'm very curious to hear how you guys interpret this song and what you think of the significance of it is as the closing track to this record.
You catch a motherfucker on the right day, motherfucker being me. Put this on and I'm just fucking weeping. I just fucking it's just like the greatest closing track of all time. Like I can hardly think of anything that fits that mold better. It's another curveball on the album, but I think when you look at it holistically, it makes so much sense to end this thoroughly bizarre, alien sounding album on like one of the most human notes that it could be left on.
Mm. It's like a reminder that despite this whole like subjective synthetic alien experience of the world that you've been thrown into, that at the end of it all, like Tom said in How to Disappear Completely, that's not me. And you get a sense of the real human beneath all of these layers of just toxic poison that the world has thrown onto him. Like his experiences have led him to that he wants to communicate, and it's that, and it's paired back beautifully here, and it's the surprise ending that I could have never predicted, like August, the first time I heard this album, but feels in retrospect like the most beautiful capstone, and also a neat reminder of the fact that for all the abstraction of this album, there is an emotional core to it that carries through all of it, that it's not just this cold alien thing entirely. It is the reason all of that stuff is cold and alien is because we know it in contrast to the humanity, that we all hopefully experience, and motion picture soundtrack is a beautiful reminder of that at the end, as well as just being a kind of devastating song. In Kid A, Tom says, "I tripped on a little white lie," and you get a sense in that kind of surreal line of the alien abstraction and falsity of the world consuming him, or like bowling him over. And then there's a reflection in this song, "They fed us on little white lies," that suggests in the tense of the line that that this world is now in the rearview mirror, and that in many ways it feels like a death song, like you're dying and you're moving forward into the next life.
I think the idea of a death song would make sense, like in line with the kind of parallel structure of this album of sorts, where Treefingers is the departure of the spiritual, this being the departure of the physical, would make sense, and it also being the most human. That and Treefingers being the songs that, even despite Treefingers' modifications, sounding the most human and familiar and least alien to you, I think that makes perfect sense as like that parallel structure of closing out the record on kind of the same note you transition from one part of it to the other.
Yeah, devastating. And when those fucking fluttering harps come in, it's like I almost feel like it shouldn't work, but it does. It's this beautiful explosion, but like this soft explosion, and it just unravels me.
I think that there's a bit of I guess I wouldn't call it a theory, I guess. I mean, I'm sure someone somewhere has made this parallel at some point or another. But I mean, first of all, I'd like to say that while Kid A is not even close to my favorite Radiohead album, nor do I think that's a perfect record. The moment where the harps come in on motion picture soundtrack is the best moment in this entire discography. Nothing makes me feel that way. That said, I view motion picture soundtrack as a sister song to exit music for a film from OK Computer, not just because of the very obvious title similarity thing you got going on there, but because both, like Tyler much earlier mentioned, that like there's a lot of ideas on Kid A that are not quite the same as OK Computer, but definitely analogous in a whole lot of ways. And I see this sort of this element of kind of hellish dystopia in both of them, even if OK Computer is probably a bit more purgatorial. But that moment on Exit Music is, you have this story of these two lovers and they escape, and it's sort of left up to interpretation as to whether or not they make it out alive, what it is they're making it out of, or what even happens to them. It's just sort of the thrill of the moment. in my opinion here, at least, August kind of mentioned at several points on the album. There's like these, there's like a moment where it mentions dinosaurs, and there's also a moment on, I think it's Idioteque, I think, where he talks about the Ice Age.
Yeah.
And to me, there's these allusions to time periods are sort of like a cyclical thing, almost as if the world has been created and destroyed multiple times so that it's like gone through another ice age and gone through another period where there were dinosaurs, because the world has just like fucked itself so hard that it started over. And that's what I get out of the meaning of I'll see you in the next life. Like he talks, like the lyrics at the very beginning talk about, I mean, like it's taking a bunch of sleeping pills so you can die. Basically, the character, whoever it is in the song, is, you know, about to OD on sleeping pills and die. So it's like you could see that as sad, but it's also like, A, they could be escaping this obviously hellish, oppressive world, or B, that says, I'll see you in the next life, which is sort of like maybe he'll get the chance to start again like everything else has so far. But also it has that ambiguity of just like, are these two people going to die? Is death something that would in the long term be like a benefit for them? Are they going to someday be reincarnated into that next life, and is that actually going to be worth it? And I just really love that element, and I think that using it as like the final sting for the album is just fucking perfect.
So let's take a step back then. We've discussed every song on this album, and I think we've done a really good job of painting the picture of Kid A, the album experience, and the way that it is constructed. And I think it's meaningful because over the years I've had a weird relationship with this album where it's like I haven't always gotten it. Like for a long time I didn't really get it. I didn't really get that structural aspect to it. But it's kind of come into place for me a lot recently, and especially in the context of doing this series where we're talking about these albums in order, and I'm thinking more and more actively about like how Radiohead are approaching each record relative to the previous ones. And in many ways this just feels like their magnum opus. Like while there are other albums that I love in this discography, like the conceptual density of OK Computer is astounding, and just the general songwriting quality of a record like In Rainbows is undeniable, as we'll talk about in a few weeks' time. For me, this is the album where songwriting, artistic vision, and conceptual coherency are all at their strongest and most unified for Radiohead, in a way that they aren't quite on those other two albums, even though I think those are amazing records. This is just the album where it feels like the fullest statement for Radiohead, and that it arrives out of such a dense and strange combination of abstraction and this distinct human element that underpins it all. It's fitting for a band like Radiohead, who are as strange and abstract relative to their, rock contemporaries in this time anyway. Kid A is this landmark because it represents this subversion of expectations for the world's biggest band. But it also is a landmark because it is a band who made a masterpiece with OK Computer, somehow finding a way to access a truer self and make an even more defining masterpiece by completely flipping the script somehow. It is such a remarkable record that for its 10 tracks, and for as much as we've tried to clearly define and simplify and break down all of these elements to it, just has this really indescribable, unnameable, ephemeral quality to it that when it's on, it feels like this entirely new world that I don't fully understand, but that I am content to surrender myself to. And the idea of surrender as a form of release, as a form of freedom, is at the core of this record, I think. And that is why I think it is their greatest record.
To elaborate on that a bit, I agree, but saying it's the best Radiohead album to me, or that it's my favorite Radiohead album more appropriately, is like almost like irrelevant. like it doesn't matter that it's like there's nothing bold or interesting in saying that it's the best Radiohead album. It's just it almost feels separate from them in how it feels like it was sent from the ether to pacify my soul. And I kind of hate when critics will claim ownership of something in the way like this was made for me. But like if you believe in the sort of everything happens for a reason, the universe is cosmically tied together, you know, bunch of Buddhist shit basically. The reason that this album was made, one of the millions of reasons that this album was made, when you look at it on that macro scale, was to ease my strange addled mind. And it's not my favorite album ever, but only when it's not playing.
I must say that I did allude earlier to the fact that this is not exactly my favorite, and the reason I say that really is not because I have any large issues with it, as my score will undoubtedly reflect. The only reason being is that the moments on this album that are my favorite moments and the moments that I deem to be the best are so catastrophically high, and the things that aren't my absolute favorites, there's a wider gap between those things than there is on OK Computer for me, which is a meaningless designation in and of itself. It's just sort of the way I've come to it. It's just because as I've grown more accustomed to this band, I've just sort of learned that like the second half of Kid A is definitely an acquired taste, and it wasn't something I always completely got on with, even though I definitely do now. But even so, it's an album that I think is excellent and deserves its reputation that it has, even with all the hyperbole and Pitchfork reviews aplenty. But it's really just more of the fact that this is just not the Radiohead album for Jake. But the fact that I still think
everybody's got their one.
Jake,
So,
yeah, I want to say, Jake, you don't have to justify it not being the Radiohead
oh no,
album for you.
I'm not. That's my point here, is that I'm not going to justify it, and but the thing is that I still think this is fucking like favorite wherever you rank it. Who fucking gives a shit when the fact that I've been throwing on How to Disappear Completely for the past 5 years of my life, every time I felt like tepid dog shit, and that song has made me feel like alive in the worst moments of my life. Like nothing can take that away from me, from this album, from fucking whatever. I can tell you that this album is like a fucking stillbirth on an IMAX screen or whatever the fuck. But what really counts for it,
it's womb-like.
Sure,
that's another one of my favorite words from the review.
But the point is that this record is like, whether or not it ends up being your favorite or an album that you even love, you owe it, A, because of the historical context around it, just because it's an important canon record, and B, just because, like, I don't know, this has some of the most interesting highlights in music of the century thus far. And I think that's pretty fucking undeniable, no matter where you come down on it. Like, with my favorite Radiohead album, which I won't spoil for the sake of the retrospective, even though I'm sure people know, it's really more of a sense of appreciating the consistency rather than like the heights necessarily. But like nothing in this discography really hits the height of How to Disappear Completely, of Motion Picture Soundtrack, of Treefingers, of those select moments that truly do feel like you're like, maybe that fucking Pitchfork guy had a fucking point. But those moments, they're rare from this point forward. I think Kid A has the most of them, and that's, in a band like this, that's incredibly valuable.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like the who's your favorite Beatle thing. It's like what's your favorite Radiohead album? I think it says a lot about who you are as a person.
Oh yeah.
Like Yeah, and I'm not going to elaborate on that because there's no real point doing it because we haven't reviewed all their albums yet. But we can come back to that idea when we finish this retrospective and we talk about what our favorite ones are. And I
could write an essay on why Morgan has the Benz being ranked higher than OK Computer says more about him than the fact that his favorite is Kid A. I could write pages on that shit, man.
I think it's indicative of the same thing as Kid A being my favorite in that it's I'm fucking losing my mind at any given moment.
Yeah, like I do genuinely believe that you can glean a lot about a person from their favorite Radiohead album, which is such a music nerd thing to say. All right, well, okay, well, we beautifully summed that up. Is there anything else you want to add, August, before we kind of?
Yeah, I was gonna say the newbie. We got to know what you have to say about this and.
I mean, I guess in the context of their career, obviously, knowing quite literally nothing going forward, this is an exciting moment. To feel like the band has come out even more fully formed than they were before. Well, maybe that's a bad statement. They've redefined themselves in a way that's rather interesting to me, and I look forward to seeing where they're going. I don't know what that's going to be, and and this has obviously opened me up a lot to keep my mind very open towards whatever that is.
I will say
I'm supremely envious of you.
I will say, I believe there's not a single other album in this catalog that is remotely anything like Kid A. Even, and I'll emphasize this especially next week. Even Amnesiac, which was recorded at exactly the same time.
Another Kid A.
But that's the thing. That's the beautiful thing about Radiohead is that every album's a curveball, but also at the same time, I feel like also every album that follows this has the DNA of this and it deep embedded in it within it somewhere to some extent, and that's the beautiful thing about it as a reinvention for Radiohead here.
It's like none of them are going to be Kid A again, but that also doesn't mean that any of them are going to be easy.
Okay, favorite tracks and ratings then for Kid A. You know what I think we should do? Because August is experiencing these records for the first time, I reckon he should go last every time we do this. So let's just go like normal order, but August can wait till last. So Jake.
So we can just sit here like Gendo Ikari for
let's not deny the excitement of waiting for August rating for an album that, you know, we have had in our lives for a decade. It's always...
Please post in the comments which Evangelion character we're analogous to.
But anyway, Jake, what are your 3 favorite tracks, least favorite track if you have one, and rating?
All right, kids, say it with me. How to Disappear Completely is my number 1. Number 2, Treefingers, and number 3, motion picture soundtrack. I'm so very, very sorry, Idioteque. I love you. I will always love you. You're a 10 out of 10. Least favorite track, Morning Bell. Great song. I just like it makes me anxious, and that's good. And it's a good song. It's just like, damn. How to Disappear Completely is pretty great though. Hate being comparative like that, but this is just how it be with Kid A. And I give the album a 9 out of 10.
Beautiful. That means Morgan is next.
All right. Fucking my 3 favorite tracks. Yes. Least favorite, no. Fucking. Okay. I'll probably say. I'll say the title track, because people be doing that one a little dirty sometimes. And I'll say Idioteque. And I mean, look, How to Disappear Completely is my number 1 on the album. I think it just barely doesn't make top 5, which is interesting for a song on my favorite Radiohead album. But, you know, band be good. The goddamn motion picture soundtrack. And I mean, like, you know, probably like a light 7. No. Imagine I did this whole review like this and just like 7.
I'd have so much fucking respect for you. That would be so good.
That would mean that I have been gaslighting Jake for the entire time that I've known him.
Yes, and
wow.
honestly, I might just like I debated as to whether or not I like was going to slip in like when people are just like, "Hey Jake, what do you think?" I was dangerously close to reading one of the lesser known paragraphs from the Pitchfork review just to see if you'd notice.
Morgan, you jokingly giving this a 7 is the same energy as call an ambulance, but not from me.
That is.
All right.
Yeah, it's a 10. Fucking no doy.
My 3 favorite tracks.
Yes.
Morgan's bit of yes as the 3 favorite tracks. This is difficult not to just steal. I'll say, yeah, How to Disappear Completely. My second favorite song on the record is actually Everything in Its Right Place. And my third favorite is Idioteque. I don't have a least favorite, and it's a 10 from me.
Of note, Saoirse not present gives
Okay.
it a 10 also.
Indeed. Okay.
So
It's pillow time.
my 3 favorite tracks are the National Anthem, Idioteque, and Everything in Its Right Place. My least favorite is Optimistic. I give Kid A an 8 out of 10.
We got one.
We finally got one. Hallelujah.
I said it. I said we were in an upwards direction.
Yeah. And
Amnesiac 9 when.
no,
I'm
it's
not
happening.
I doubt it, but it also wouldn't surprise me. Just because people's
Yeah.
reactions to that album are so fucking weird. Like,
Yeah.
it's just, how do you think Amnesiac's better than an OK Computer? How do you think that? How do you think that?
Wobble.
Yes. So, yeah. I look
That's not
forward.
to say that you're not allowed to think that.
I look
course
forward
you
to
are.
a very energetic debate next week. Even though I probably am pretty close to how you feel about that record. Anyway, so let us know what you think of Kid A, what this record means to you, how you feel it stacks up in the discography. Are you like, me and Morgan and think this album is king shit? Or do you think they have better shit? Let us know in the comments below. Let us know if we missed anything in terms of talking about this album as well. And next week, same time, we will be back again to talk about Amnesiac and the Amnesiac B-sides. So stay tuned for that. And August, I think you should lead us out this time.
All right, everyone. As always, rock over London, rock on Chicago, General Electric, imagination at work.